this Bible study on Tuesday, and Glenn says, I'll be very interested to see what you come up with after this.
Maybe I should know what the Spirit comes up with.
Yeah, well, that's hopefully she showed up. Our scripture reading for today is from Jesus' parable of the judgment of the sheep and the goats, Matthew 25, starting at 31. First, I want to clarify that in the parable, the Son of Man is Jesus. The Son of Man is also the King who judges the whole world. And that is Jesus. Now, at first glance, it may seem like this parable is saying that those people who do good things get into heaven, and those people who do bad things go to hell. If that were the case, there would have been no need for Jesus to come and sacrifice his life for us. Every religion in the world will tell you that the good people get a wonderful afterlife and the bad people don't. In this parable, at the end of the world, all the nations of the world are judged by how they treated the least of these who are members of Jesus' family. That is, the entire world, which probably includes Christians, are judged by how they treat the least of these members of Jesus' family. So let's take a moment and think about who the least of these members of Jesus' family are. It seems as though they are probably the poorest Christians, the least of these. The people who live on the street are in their car. Children in foster care who've been bounced around from one home to the next. The least of these are probably those Christians who've been marginalized. Maybe those who are gay or transsexual. Maybe the poor immigrants from countries south of Mexico. Did you know that most of those immigrants are probably Christian? But let's think of some other Christians that are marginalized. Well, there are the drug addicts who are either part of the opiate crisis or addicted to crack cocaine or heroin. It's easiest just to lock them up rather than to try and treat them. It's much more expensive to lock them up, but it's easier. The least of these may be the mentally ill who are difficult to care for. Did you know that it was back in the 1980s when we closed most of the state mental hospitals because they were so expensive? And we all benefited from that on our taxes. But now there are very few long-term mental health treatment centers. The least of these might be those with expensive pre-existing medical conditions. And we could go on and on listing those who are probably among the least of these. And you might have some issues with supporting one or two or more of these groups of the least of these. Certainly you would not want your tax dollars to be spent supporting them. And I understand. I get it. It would be very, very expensive taking care of all of the least of these in the world, or even in our community. But my point is that you and I should actually be very nervous when we hear that the King of heaven and earth, the Son of Man who sits on the throne of judgment, says that he is in the midst of those people that we actually marginalize, are shunned. Jesus is in the least of these. I must tell you that I'm not very fond of this parable of the Son of Man judging the nations. Because people often assume that they would be among the sheep who help the poor or the least of these. And it is true, we do help the least of these here and throughout the world. But at the very same time, we are the ones who do not help as much as we could. I can't see any of us significantly dipping into our retirement account to give to the Hanover Area Council churches or the New Hope Ministries. And we have turned a blind eye to the government underfunding agencies like Children and Youth Services and limiting people's access to food stamps. On the other hand, maybe this is not a parable that outlines the final judgment of the world. Maybe this is a parable to remind you and me of our own attitudes. To remind you that you are not good and perfect and deserving of all of the glories of heaven. Maybe this is a parable to remind you and me of God's grace towards us. God's grace toward you. That Jesus has not chosen to judge you by your deeds. Jesus has not chosen to decide the eternal fate of your soul by how good and perfect you are. Instead, Jesus has chosen to sacrifice his life for your salvation, for my salvation, for the salvation of the whole world. Jesus has chosen to completely cleanse you of all of your sin and guilt in any shape or form. Jesus has given you the highest and holiest of gifts. Jesus has given you the very Spirit of God to guide you, to give you eternal hope and deep joy. Rather than judging you, Jesus is continually giving you the power to love and forgive, the power to be gracious and kind. Because of Jesus, you don't have to worry about your salvation. You don't have to worry about earning anything. It has all been given to you. And so you can be abundantly thankful, truly grateful for all that you have been given. And from this gratefulness, a grateful heart, you may be generous whenever and wherever you please. Not worrying about some final judgment, but so thankful, ever so thankful, that the King is a part of your family, and you are a part of his family.